Of the Provost Lecture Series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to ask you to kindly take note of our next event, the final lecture of this term. On Thursday, April 15th, Philip Budd, who is senior lecturer at Westminster College, Oxford, will present a talk entitled A Theology of the Environment, Problems and Possibilities. And right now, that one's scheduled for 11 o'clock in Bracken 225. I think many of you know that through the Westminster Exchange Program with our university, a number of our faculty and our students have become acquainted with Professor Budd, and they certainly join me in anticipating his ideas on a rather interesting subject. To repeat then, the lecture is scheduled for April 15, 11 a.m. in Bracken 225, and I hope you can come. Today we have a very special opportunity, and that is to have on our campus David Quammen. Variously identified by people who have read his work for many years as novelist, essayist, columnist for Outside Magazine, Rhodes Scholar, Guggenheim Fellow, fishing guide, and I emphasize that's fly fishing guide, and kayaker. As his publisher identifies him, he's a Renaissance guy. He was born in Cincinnati, earned his BA degree at Yale University, and then took a B. Lit degree as a Rhodes Scholar at Merton College, Oxford. A noted writer of fiction, Mr. Quammen published his first novel, To Walk the Line, at age 22. After basing this book on his experiences working in a Chicago ghetto, he shifted to thriller novels, namely The Zolta Configuration and The Soul of Victor Tronco. At the same time, he was writing short fiction, some of which is collected in a book entitled Bloodline, Stories of Fathers and Sons. These first-rate novellas, sometimes reminiscent of Hemingway and Faulkner, have been called, and I quote from one reviewer, old-fashioned yarns, the kind that grab the reader, make him listen to the voices, hold him to the end, and then linger in his consciousness. While Mr. Quammen has garnered such praise for his fiction, he is perhaps more noted for his essays on nature, collected in Natural Acts, a sidelong view of science and nature published in 1985, and his second collection of natural history essays, The Flight of the Iguana, which came out in 1988, and according to one critic writing in the Los Angeles Times, and I quote, "These essays show Mr. Quammen's ability to use science as a way to reflect on other subjects, some political, some philosophical, some just wise ruminations on this and that." By now, he has written over 100 columns and a score of features for Outside Magazine. And for those of you who haven't seen the current Outside Magazine, I urge you to get it because there's a wonderful piece in there that David wrote on his experiences kayaking. And I assure you reading that is an unforgettable experience. It may inspire you to go kayaking. It may forever put out of your mind any thought of going kayaking. In 1987, he was presented with the National Magazine Award for Essays and Criticism, and he's been nominated for that award on 2 other occasions. A friend on Outside Magazine staff may have summed up the secret of David's success when he called him part comic essayist, part fly in the ointment of linear thinking. Currently, David Quammen makes his home in one of my favorite places, and I know that of many in the audience, Bozeman, Montana, where he is at work on a new nonfiction book, The Song of the Dodo, concerning evolution and extinction on islands of the world. Today, he will share with us some of his observations and findings from that project. Please join me now in welcoming David Quammen to Ball State University. Hello.
Am I on? Am I audible? Okay, hello to all of you. And thank you, Warren, and thanks to everybody in the Provost's office for inviting me here today. It's good to be here. I've been thinking about Muncie, Indiana a little bit this week because it was, I think, just 30 years ago this week that there was a Muncie fellow who was very famous in the world of basketball named Ron Bonham, as the University of Cincinnati was failing to defend their national championship. I'm going to talk about some other bits of ancient history and current history. 8 years ago, I read newspaper item about the disappearance of birds from the island of Guam. Guam, as you probably know, is in the western Pacific, about halfway between Hawaii and Japan. It's just a tiny little island, but it had a number of bird species that were found nowhere else. These birds were endemic to the island of Guam. Endemic being the biologist's fancy term to say that they had evolved in that place and they lived nowhere else. Endemic species. Suddenly, some of those species had gone extinct, and some others had gone to the brink of extinction, and nobody could figure out what was happening. Finally, some scientists on Guam figured out that a species of snake was eating up all the birds. This was a long, skinny, tree-climbing snake. The species name was Boiga irregularis, and it was suddenly incredibly abundant on the island of Guam. That's a baby version there that this herpetologist collected in the forest of Guam at night using night vision goggles of the same sort that helicopter pilots wore in Vietnam. Now, this snake, Boiga irregularis, was not native to Guam. Normally it lived in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, about a couple thousand miles to the west. Evidently, it had invaded the island of Guam on a cargo flight sometime during or just after World War II. Until that point, Guam itself didn't have any species of tree-climbing, bird-eating snakes. It was snakeless, almost as snakeless as legendarily Ireland after St. Patrick. The only snake on Guam was a tiny little worm snake that was not a threat to anything. So because of that absence of predatory snakes, the birds of Guam had no defenses against predatory snakes. They'd evolved essentially in a fool's paradise for birds, where you didn't need defenses against tree-climbing, bird-eating snakes. They were ecologically naive. The way they built their nests, the way they defended their young, the way they placed their nests, their social behavior, none of those things had evolved in such a way as to defend them against tree-climbing, bird-eating snakes. Consequently, this snake arrived, multiplied, became incredibly abundant on the island of Guam, and ate up all the birds. I wrote a magazine column about this situation back then. I saw the newspaper item. I made a few phone calls to Guam. I did some research in the library, wrote a magazine column. And then I thought at first that I was going to be done with it. I thought it was a small subject and that the following month I'd move on to something else. But in the course of doing that research, I discovered that there was a huge body of scientific research and theory devoted to this subject. Not just the island of Guam and the birds, but to the subject of islands and how they function ecologically. There was a whole field of science devoted to this, and the situation that was happening on Guam was just a little tip of an iceberg of a set of patterns and processes that ecologists and evolutionary biologists take very seriously, so I discovered. This field of science is called island biogeography. A little bit of a tongue twister, island biogeography. It sounds narrow, esoteric, and obscure, maybe, but it turns out that it has to do with a lot more than just the study of islands. It's a large subject, and to me it had the appeal of being full of cheap thrills. Strange beasts and exotic faraway places and dramatic events. Besides the cheap thrills, it also happens to be genuinely important. And it's getting to be more important all the time. Why is it getting to be more important? Because we humans we're peeling up and paving over wild landscape all over the surface of our planet. As we're doing that, we're not just destroying wild land, We're also fragmenting it. We're breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces. We're chopping the great ecosystems of the planet up into little island-like parcels. Now these ecological fragments, they tend to behave like islands in a number of ways that I'm going to talk about. Some of them are obscure, some of them are tiny, some of them you never heard of, and some of them have names like Yosemite, Yellowstone National Park, Serengeti National Park, Virunga Volcanoes National Park, Central Park. These ecological fragments, these ecological islands, and I guess you'd put islands in quotation marks, they're surrounded by pavement and wheat fields and cattle ranches and suburbs and interstate highways, and not by ocean. But still, ecologically, they function as islands. So 6 years ago, I started researching a book on this subject in order to try and explain it to the general public. I went to islands all over the world. I went to Guam, first of all, went to the Galapagos, went to Madagascar and Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. I went to New Guinea. I went to Bali and Krakatau and Komodo in Indonesia. Went to Tasmania, a number of other places. I also went to some of the great mainland ecosystems that are being hacked up into islands. The central Amazon, for instance. And I talked to a lot of the scientists who are studying these effects and the consequences of this situation. At this point, finally, I'm just about done. I've written about 900 pages and have maybe 100 pages to go, and if I deliver the book by July 1st, my publisher won't strangle me. In the meantime, I leave in 3 weeks to go out on one final research trip back to Indonesia to collect one, I hope, final bit of research for the ending of the book. And a little set of islands that are part of eastern Indonesia, extreme eastern Indonesia, just off the coast of New Guinea, called the Aru Islands, which are very difficult to get to, but contain, at least at last report, an amazing richness of bird of paradise species just on this little set of islands. I need to get there and see if they still do. What I want to do today is just show you a few pictures and share a few facts and ideas about this subject. I've been willing to give it what is going to amount to about 7 years of work because this subject has what every freelance writer longs for in a subject. Freelance writer is somebody who writes for grocery money and mortgage payments, as well as for art and truth, and I'm one of those. This has what every freelance writer drools for. It's a subject that's not just interesting and entertaining and contains cheap thrills, and it's not just important and serious and momentous, but it's a subject, I think at least, which is both very interesting and very important. I'm going to try and get a little bit of that across today. First, a couple of very quick disclaimers. I'm not a lecturer by profession. I don't want to be. I don't aspire to be. I'm just a writer who's sharing some thoughts of a work in progress. So I'm not polished at this particular activity. I am definitely not a professional photographer. As you'll see, that's a separate job, and it's not my job. I carry a tiny little automatic camera when I go on my travels, but I pay much more attention to my notebook. Occasionally I yank out this little Olympus, and all we'll really be able to say for my photography is that, at least in the cases of what you see today, I did get the lens cap off. But I have taken some bad snapshots of some very wonderful things. So allow for the parallax of ineptitude, give me a break on focus, and use your imagination a little bit. The third disclaimer is that since this is a book in progress, I haven't written the ending yet. That has to happen during the month of June. So there really is no ending to this talk either. I'll just stop, I'll stop quacking at you in about an hour. What is island biogeography? First, let's say what biogeography is. Biogeography, as you'd assume, I suppose, from the word, is the science that explains where species of animals and plants are found, where they're not found, and why. In other words, it's a science that studies animal and plant species distribution on the geographical surface of the world. Iguanas, for instance, are a family of reptiles with a number of different species, but iguana species are found only in Latin America, in the Galapagos archipelago, and in Madagascar, that big island on the far side of Africa. That's where you find iguanas. No iguanas on the continent of Africa itself. To say so, and to explain why, is the business of biogeography. Likewise, the tiger, Panthera tigris, is found only in Asia and in a few of the Indonesian islands that are close enough to Asia that during the last ice age, when the oceans were lower, those islands were attached to mainland Asia, were part of mainland Asia. Sumatra, Java, tigers are present, or until recently they were present on Java, and they still are present, native on the island of Sumatra. Throughout Southeast Asia and Siberia, you find tigers. Bali, a tiny little island just off the east end of the big island of Java, had its own subspecies of tiger, Panthera tigris balica, until just 50 years ago, a little smaller than the other tigers. But it had its own tiger. Now, just beyond Bali, there's another island called Lombok, which was not attached to the mainland of Asia during lowered seas of the last ice age. And Lombok has never had a native population of tigers. Bali, yes. Lombok, no. Lombok, on the other hand, has cockatoos that extend through Indonesia and Australia, spread westward as far as Lombok. You go to Bali, no cockatoos. The business of biogeography is to record these facts and to try to explain them. Why are there tigers in Asia but no tigers in Africa? Why are there rhinos in Asia but no giraffes in Asia? Why? There are answers, and biogeography is the science that supplies those answers. Island biogeography, then, is the study of the patterns of animal and plant species distribution on islands and on any fragment of landscape that's isolated like an island. Okay. What is it that happens on islands that's so interesting and important? Two things. The evolution of new species and the extinction of species. Evolution and extinction, that's all. I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those. We all know that Charles Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, saw the amazing species there, including the giant tortoises, and got the idea for his theory of evolution. Why did it happen in the Galapagos? Is there something special about the Galapagos? Special soil, special air? No, there isn't. Darwin could have gotten the same evidence from a number of other places. He could have gotten it from the Hawaiian Islands, for instance. He could have gotten the same kind of evidence from New Zealand. He could have gotten the same kind of evidence really from any group of isolated islands. Nothing special about the Galapagos. The crucial thing for Darwin was that he went to a group of isolated islands. And he says that in The Origin of Species. He talks about the importance of islands. Another man came up with the same theory as Darwin, the same idea explaining the evolution of species at almost exactly the same time. Alfred Russel Wallace was his name. He was another Englishman. He was about 20 years younger than Darwin. And unlike Darwin, he was poor. He was a working class kid. He had no connections to the British scientific establishment the way Darwin did. He didn't have a father who could pay for him to spend 5 years sailing around the world on the Beagle and looking at natural history the way Darwin did. Wallace had to, maybe I like him because he was a freelancer. He worked on the basis of a smile and a shoe shine. He traveled around the world, and he had to support himself by collecting specimens of butterflies and beetles and mammals and birds and shipping them back to England for sale to people who just wanted to have display cabinets of those things, which was common in Victorian England. Wallace went to what in those days was called the Malay Archipelago and what today is called Indonesia. Sumatra, Java, Bali, Lombok, that's Borneo, this whole area. Indonesia, in those days it was known as the Malay Archipelago, 13,000 islands, roughly. Wallace went out there and spent 8 years prowling around, collecting, looking at animals, and really by no coincidence, he came up with the same theory as Darwin had, evolution by natural selection, before Darwin had ever published his. He was 20 years younger than Darwin, but Darwin waited 20 years, so Wallace caught up with him, wrote up this theory into a scientific paper, mailed it to Darwin, and caused a great moral crisis for Darwin, deciding whether he was going to help this fellow get his idea published and thereby give up priority for his own great theory and his life's work. Don't get me started on that. That is an interesting story. It's part of what I'm writing about in this book, but I won't digress into it. So both of these fellows went to islands. Both of them discovered evolution by natural selection. What was so special about islands to these two and to a lot of biologists since then? Well, islands are isolated by definition. Evolution functions on the basis of isolation. That's the first point. Evolution of new species doesn't happen without isolation. The greater the isolation, the more restricted the isolation, the more quickly evolution of new species is likely to occur. Also, once it's occurred, evolutionary patterns are more obvious on islands. Islands show the cartoon version of evolution. Why is that? Well, the ecosystem on an island is generally simpler than the ecosystem on a mainland, with fewer species, fewer relationships between species, and what species there are on an island tend to be more bizarre than the species on a mainland. The differences between species are more bizarre, more striking. The relationships, the genealogical relationships, are more striking. So, consequently, an alert scientist like Darwin or like Wallace could look at a set of islands, and not just the Galapagos, not just the Malay Archipelago, but any set of islands, and could see patterns of evolution there. The same patterns would exist on the mainlands, do exist on the mainlands, but on the mainlands those patterns are much more obscure and confusing and difficult to untangle. Okay, I said that endemic is the term biologists use for a species that evolved in a particular place and it's found only there. The islands of the world are full of endemic species. Many of them are especially peculiar in terms of their size, their shape, or other features of their anatomy or their physiology or their behavior. Let me tell you about a few island endemics. Galapagos has the world's only species of seagoing reptile, seagoing reptile that is not a crocodilian. The Galapagos marine iguana, Amblyrhynchus cristatus. This is a critter that lives along the coasts of the Galapagos Islands, swims out into the surf during high tide, dives down under the water to eat seaweed off of the rocks underwater. It's very unusual for a reptile to do that sort of thing. Certainly, no other iguanas do it anywhere on Earth. This species is adapted to it because the tail is especially strongly muscled and flattened from side to side. So they wave the tail back and forth, almost like the rear fin of a fish, and they swim that way. Galapagos has also got two species of land iguana found nowhere else, endemic land iguanas of the genus Conolophus. These are larger than any iguanas on the mainlands, and they feed on prickly pear cactus pads, thorns and all. That's what a prickly pear cactus looks like in the Galapagos. There are 14 endemic species of prickly pear on the Galapagos, and most of them grow as trees. Big, stout trunk that lifts the pads up off the ground so that the land iguanas and also the giant tortoises can't eat them. The tortoises also feed on those prickly pear pads. There are something like a dozen races of giant tortoise in the Galapagos, separated on the different islands, and from one island to another, the shape of their shells differ from each other. This was one of the things that started to make Darwin think about the possibility of evolution. Although when he first got to the Galapagos and saw these creatures, he didn't think they were native to the Galapagos. He thought they had come from somewhere else. He thought they had been brought in, possibly by whaling ships, from Aldabra, a small island, again across the world, in the Indian Ocean. Aldabra does have its own species of giant tortoise. That's an Aldabra giant tortoise. It's almost as big as a Galapagos giant tortoise. But you can see the shell is different. That's Galapagos. That's Aldabra. The Galapagos species, Geochelone elephantopus, and you go across the world and you find this species, which belongs to the same genus, Geochelone gigantea. Obviously, these names aren't important, but they indicate relationships. The giant tortoises of the Galapagos, I think, are one of the things that people tend to assume suggests something magic about the Galapagos. But no, Aldabra and some other islands of the Indian Ocean also had species of giant tortoises. Gigantism among reptiles is a pattern that repeats itself on islands. This is the Komodo dragon, which is probably my favorite animal on the surface of the earth. This is a giant lizard, a predatory lizard. It's the world's largest lizard by far. It grows to be about 10 feet long, weighs about 250 pounds, and it eats meat. It eats deer, pigs, dogs, now that there are dogs on the island of Komodo. It attacks horses and water buffalo, and it occasionally attacks humans. It eats essentially anything that it wants to eat. Found only on Komodo in the Indonesian archipelago and a couple of small islands nearby. When I was in Komodo a year ago, I was in the backcountry with a ranger, and we spooked one of these things out of a bush. They're fast. It took about 3 steps toward us, then turned around, went roaring off down a hill. We chased it, making sure that we wouldn't catch up with it. Then we spooked another one, and it went straight up the side of a volcanic cliff, almost a vertical cliff. It went up about 60 feet on this cliff, just like, essentially it was like seeing a major alligator climb up the side of a 5-story building. It was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. This is a bird, or it was a bird. 10 feet tall, weighed about 1,500 pounds, lived on the island of Madagascar until not that long ago, until essentially 3 or 4 centuries ago when European colonists started arriving and started essentially started scrambling its eggs. It lays an egg on the ground, so it was very vulnerable. It was ecologically naive, like the birds of Guam. The egg, you can see at the bottom there, the egg, it's a 7-gallon egg. So the European settlers just couldn't resist this, and they killed off this animal, Epiornis maximus, it was called. Now this is another pattern that repeats itself on islands all over the world. Gigantism, but gigantism among birds is associated with flightlessness. So you find giant flightless birds. Also in New Zealand, they were called the moas. They were just about this size, and they went extinct when humanity arrived. A number of other places also, giant flightless birds. Dwarfism is another pattern. This is a dwarf hippopotamus, also from the island of Madagascar. Also only recently extinct. Madagascar is a large island like New Guinea, covered with rainforest, rivers, and an incredible abundance of endemic species. At least until recently it was. And now about 90% of the native forest has been cut away. Not that much of it looks like this anymore. This is from the southeastern coast, a place called Ranamafana, a wonderful rainforest park, which before too long will be surrounded by rice paddies and roads and human villages. But in the meantime, it's still got some amazing species. About 24 species of lemurs found only on Madagascar. Lemurs are primitive primates. Madagascar has been separated from Africa for about at least 60 million years. And this line of primates have evolved on Madagascar, just separate from the primate line in the rest of the world. This is a ringtail lemur. This is a brown lemur from that area that I mentioned, Ranamafana. This animal had been tranquilized and fallen out of the trees and had essentially been caught in a fireman's net, so it didn't hurt itself. It was being weighed and measured and checked over physically and fitted with a radio collar, and then it was going to be put back into the forest. That's a chameleon. Madagascar contains something like 90% of all the chameleon species on Earth. It's got a chameleon that's the size of an almond, world's smallest chameleon. And it has a chameleon species that's about the size, say, of a large trout. And a number of others in between, with strange horns on their noses and a lot of other bizarre adaptations. This is a baobab tree. This is a thing that looks like a turnip, or a tree that is planted upside down or something. The trunk is fat, it stores water. It has this tiny little celery top crown. And people associated it with Africa, one of the classic trees of the East African savanna, the baobab. Peter Matheson wrote about it in a book called The Tree Where Man Was Born. But there are 9 species of baobab tree in the world. One of those lives in East Africa. 1 species lives in Australia, and 7 of those species live in Madagascar. Endemism, all this is endemism that I'm talking about. Traveler's palm. You see it all over the world now, but it's endemic to Madagascar, evolved there, and originally was found only there. I'll move quickly through some of the rest of these and get to some other material. This is a rare plant called Aloe Suzanne, again endemic to Madagascar. When I was there, botanists knew of only 3 individuals of this species. That was one of them. This is what my photography is like. You know, you hold an insect in one hand and you hold your little automatic camera in the other hand and you try and take a picture of it. That's a giant stick insect, like a walking stick, on the island of New Guinea. We're in New Guinea now. It was about this long, and the local people whose feet you see there thought that a person had to be pretty idiotic to pick this thing up. An endemic species. Gigantism. New Guinea, again, at this point is still full of beautiful forest, people living in tiny villages in the backcountry, rivers, and a lot of continuous habitat. Some of the last great pieces of large continuous rainforest are on the island of New Guinea. Tree kangaroos, that's what these are, in captivity on the north coast of New Guinea. Kangaroos got across when the oceans were low from Australia. They became isolated when the oceans came back up. And they started evolving. And one of the ways that they evolved was taking to the trees. So there are 5 species of endemic tree kangaroos on the island of New Guinea. Very strange creatures. Birds, many, many endemic birds. This is a black-capped lory, endemic to New Guinea. There are also, as I said, several dozen really bizarre bird of paradise species on New Guinea and the surrounding islands. This man in the Huli Valley in central New Guinea is wearing bird of paradise feathers in that headdress. Also some cassowary feathers. Cassowary is another giant flightless bird. Related to the emus of Australia, there is also 1 or 2 cassowary species in Australia. In New Guinea, because of further evolution, as it's been isolated, the giant bird has produced a dwarf species. So this is the dwarf cassowary, a dwarf version of a giant flightless bird. This is one of the world's rarest birds. It's called the pink pigeon, found on the island of Mauritius. That's a chick, obviously. Now, Mauritius I'm going to tell you a little bit about. This is another Mauritius endemic, the Mauritius kestrel. Falco punctatus is the name of it. A kestrel is a falcon, but this falcon has evolved the anatomy and behavior of a hawk. Now, the falcons and the hawks are supposed to be distinct types of birds of prey. Falcons tend to have long, pointed wings. They fly very fast. They live in open country, and they get their food by diving on prey in the open. The peregrine falcon is a classic case. A hawk generally has shorter and stubbier wings and does more diving through forest terrain. The Mauritius kestrel is a falcon that's evolved to function as a hawk. Its wings are shorter and stubbier, and it lives on lizards that it picks off of trees while it's diving through the forests of Mauritius. Mauritius is here, tiny little island off the east coast of Madagascar, which is off the east coast of Africa. This is Mauritius. Sugarcane now exists in most of the places that used to be forest. The kestrels nest on those lava cliffs that you see on the left in holes. And traditionally that protected them from any enemies they had on the island of Mauritius. Then they would do their hunting in this forest you see below. This woman is radio tracking some kestrels there in their native habitat. The kestrel is a great success story because in 1975 it very, very nearly went extinct. They were down to 2 mated individuals in the wild and 3 or 4 other birds. At that point it was probably the world's rarest bird. People said, forget about it, give up, it's done for. You can't save a bird species that's down to just 5 or 6 individuals. It had a lot of problems. Its habitat had been cut, replaced with sugarcane. Exotic plant species had been brought into the island that were invading the forests and clogging it up so the kestrels couldn't dive through it. Exotic animals had been brought in, like the snake that had come into Guam. The kestrel had no defenses against these exotic animals. Cats, rats, mongooses. That's a mongoose that was caught on one of these cliffs in a box trap that had been set by this fellow, Carl Jones, who is almost single-handedly responsible for rescuing this species from the very brink of extinction. He came in at about 79. He said, I think we can save this bird, but we're going to have to do some crazy and aggressive things. What did he do? Well, he started climbing those cliffs to get to those nests, stealing eggs from them, taking them down into a hatchery, an aviary at his lab, hatching them in captivity, discovering that if he supplemented the diet of the kestrel, they could produce more than one clutch of eggs per year. He went out and he trained them to take mice from him in the wild. Eventually, they were so familiar with this that I went out with him. You could throw a mouse up in the air, and a kestrel that was watching would come down and take the mouse out of the air and take it back and give it to its mate. He did a number of things, pulling eggs like that from wild nests, letting the wild pair produce further eggs, hatching the eggs that he pulled in captivity, raising them, breeding a number of kestrels in captivity, working through the genetic problems, finally releasing them to the wild. From the brink of extinction, a number of other things like that. From the brink of extinction in 1975, with about 5 or 6 animals total, he's brought it back so that now there are about 120 in the wild and another 50 or so in captivity. It's still not beyond danger, but with a combination of captive breeding, egg pulling, production of second clutches by the bird, supplemental feeding, trapping mongooses to protect the nests, and a number of other things, he's managed to nurse this bird back to a healthy population. That's a fellow from the Peregrine Fund feeding raw chopped quail breast to about two one-day-old Mauritius kestrels. The bird seems to be safe now, although it came close to the brink. This is another Mauritian endemic. Anybody recognize this beast? Dodo, yeah. Yeah. A giant flightless pigeon found only on the island of Mauritius, the dodo. Rhapis cuculatus was the species. It probably ate fruit. It went extinct sometime in the 17th century, again because it had no defenses against the new things that were happening on this island after humans settled it. It wasn't just that humans were eating the dodo, although that was part of it. It was also the fact that humans had brought in cats, dogs, goats, other enemies of the dodo, because it laid its eggs on the ground. It had no protection against them. But at its time, it was an amazing bird, an amazing endemic, probably the world's largest pigeon. So there's more to be said about that. I don't want to get distracted on it either. Okay, endemics from all over the world. Why do islands produce all these odd endemic species? There are two main reasons. The first is ecological release. And by that, what I mean is the absence of those predator and competitor species that you find on the mainland and that make life such a god-awful struggle on the mainlands. Islands tend to be free of predators, tend to contain few competitor species for each species. Consequently, with few predators and few competitors, it's possible for evolution to experiment recklessly, to take chances, to throw out creatures like a giant flightless bird or an iguana that feeds on seaweed or a dwarf hippopotamus. On islands, evolution can take chances because experimentation isn't punished the way it's punished on the mainlands. The second reason for evolution moving quickly and wildly on islands is that islands generally support just a small population of a given species. A small population, now this stands to reason, less area if individuals of a given species require a certain amount of territory than if you've got a smaller bounded territory, that territory can support a smaller population of that species. Small populations are important in the evolutionary process because a small population can undergo a complete genetic change much more quickly than a large population. If there's a mutation, there's a random gene change in some animal, and that gene change turns out to be useful, it turns out to be a positive adaptation, then that gene change can spread through the entire population by heredity much more quickly if the population is small than it can through a large population. Same way that a rumor can spread completely through a small town a lot faster than it can spread through a city. So island populations, by definition, in circumstance, being small populations means that they tend to respond to new evolutionary opportunities more quickly and drastically than mainland species. That's what all this endemism business is about. Okay, what does it have to do with extinction? It has plenty to do with extinction. For the same reason that islands produce more crazy endemic species, they're also more vulnerable to extinction. Islands simply suffer more extinctions than mainlands. Let's take just birds, and let me burden you with a quick flurry of statistics. In the last 3 centuries, according to one count, 127 species and subspecies of birds have gone extinct in the world in roughly the last 3 centuries. 127 species and subspecies of birds all over the world during historical times. Of those 127, 116 were island species, species that were endemic to islands. So that's something like 90%. You can see that extinction essentially has been an island phenomenon. Of those 116 species that went extinct on islands, and this is also an important point, 87 went extinct on small islands, only 29 went extinct on large islands. Does my arithmetic work there? Does 87 and 29 equal 116? I think so. Yeah. Okay, so again, it's almost, I don't know, 80%, maybe 90% on small islands as distinct from large islands. So besides being an island phenomenon, extinction is a small island phenomenon. Why is that? Well, it's because of what I just described. Islands support only small populations of a given species. Small populations are more vulnerable to extinction than large populations. Why are they more vulnerable? It's because it's for a number of reasons. I'll describe one. Small populations, all populations, suffer random fluctuations in population size from year to year. They have a good year, the population goes up. They have a bad year, the population goes down. Populations are constantly fluctuating in the wild. Well, no, I won't go into that. If you've got a large population, say you've got 20,000 elk in an area, and the population fluctuates, it's not going to have any terminal effect. If you've got a small population, you've got 100, 50, 200 kestrels on an island. Say you've got 200 kestrels, and the population fluctuates. The chances are much greater that it'll fluctuate to 0. If it fluctuates to 0, the species is extinct. What causes it to fluctuate? Well, a number of different things. And the scientists go deeply into this, the island biogeographers. They talk about demographic bad luck, environmental bad luck, genetic bad luck, and catastrophe. Stochastic processes, that just means random, bad luck. Environmental bad luck, say you have a drought followed by a bad winter, there's no food, population will fluctuate downward. Then you have a big forest fire. That's a catastrophe. Population will fluctuate downward still. Say you have one whole generation of this animal where not very many females are born, just by chance, and a lot of males. It's going to cut down the productivity of the species. The population will fluctuate downward still more. Once it fluctuates downward too far, you start to have inbreeding, and that's unhealthy. All these things cycle together. They can make a population fluctuate downward. If it's a big population, it'll fluctuate back upward. If it's a small population, a modest amount of fluctuation can take it to 0, and then it's extinct. Okay, in 1967, 2 young biologists published this book, Theory of Island Biogeography, and they essentially revolutionized and modernized the subject I've been talking about. They also mathematized it, but we're not going to get into that, God forbid. The two young biologists were Robert MacArthur and Edward O. Wilson. Wilson is the same fellow who's more famous for having pioneered sociobiology. And Robert MacArthur was the preeminent young theoretical ecologist of his time. He's sort of the James Dean of theoretical ecology because he died young, and nobody will ever know exactly how promising, how important he might have been. But before MacArthur died, they published this book, and this book caused a revolution, not just in island biogeography, but throughout the sciences of ecology and evolutionary biology. What the book did was explain three main patterns that had been observed for a long time in the field from the study of islands. Three main patterns in the data of what people had seen. Those three patterns were that an island tended to support fewer species than a mainland of the same size and of the same kind of habitat. So if you had 1,000 acres of rainforest and it was an island, just those 1,000 acres, it would support fewer species than 1,000 acres of rainforest in the midst of a larger rainforest. That was the first pattern. Islands supported fewer species than the same area on a mainland. The second pattern was that a small island supports fewer species than a large island. Small island, fewer species than a large island. Mauritius, fewer species by far than Madagascar. The third pattern was that remote islands tend to support fewer species than islands that are close to a mainland. MacArthur and Wilson devised an elaborate scientific theory with some curve graphs, which we're not going to worry about very much because we'd all get nosebleeds. I certainly would, and I'd probably be talking at you until noon, and we don't want that. But they explained these three patterns. And essentially, the way they explained the patterns was this. The number of species on any island, according to MacArthur and Wilson's theory, is partly determined by the rate at which species go extinct, partly determined by a couple of other things. But what drives the number of species on an island is the rate at which species go extinct, and the rate of extinctions is directly related to how small the island is and how remote it is. So they gave mathematical formulae and explanations for these facts, that an island would have the total number of species that it supported determined in part and largely by the rate at which species went extinct, and the smaller the island was, the more remote it was, the faster species would go extinct. The second important thing that MacArthur and Wilson did in their book is to get the science of ecology and the science of evolutionary biology to realize that all isolated fragments of ecosystem function as islands. Now, that book was published 26 years ago. As I said, it changed island biogeography, changed ecology and evolutionary biology. It also changed the field of conservation planning as practiced by groups like the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, even the Wilderness Society, despite the fact that most people have never heard of that book. A lot of biologists began studying the implications of this theory. During the 1970s and the 1980s, it really dominated the science of ecology. Everybody was doing studies on island biogeography. They weren't all working on literal islands, but they were studying the implications of island biogeographic theory. I'm going to tell you very quickly about two of those studies. In the central Amazon, large areas of rainforest were being clear-cut to graze cattle. The Brazilian law said that on any parcel of forest that was owned by any single person, only half of the rainforest could be cut. Only half of any parcel could be cut, and the other half had to be left standing in forest. So a man named Tom Lovejoy, who was with the World Wildlife Fund then, got the idea of persuading these ranchers to arrange their cutting in a way that would leave patches of rainforest surrounded by oceans of clear-cut. Those patches would be perfectly square, measured, and censused before they were isolated. A patch of 1 hectare, which is roughly, I think, 2.5 acres. 1 hectare, it's a measurement of area in the metric. A patch of 10 hectares, a patch of 100 hectares. Lovejoy arranged that there would be a series of these patches in sequential sizes left out in the middle of this desolate, parched, godforsaken clear-cut that formerly had been Amazon rainforest. And then he and other scientists would study what happened. What happened over time because of the isolation of these little islands of rainforest. How many species went extinct? How quickly did they go extinct? Which species went extinct? What was the final result? How much real ecosystem was left on an island of rainforest like that, surrounded by an ocean of clear-cut? And what was the relationship of size and remoteness of these various different islands to the amount of extinction that they suffered? The Lovejoy project began about 14 years ago. And so far, the results that have come in confirm MacArthur and Wilson's theory about islands. The smaller the forest patch and the more remote the forest patch, the more quickly species go extinct from it. And when I say go extinct from it, I'm talking about local extinctions now. Obviously, a species disappears from that and it's not extinct in the global sense. It's gone locally extinct from that patch. But local extinction is important because obviously when you get the entire Earth cut up into patches and you have local extinctions on each patch of a particular species, then the species has gone extinct globally. The other interesting study was done about 1980 as a PhD project by a young fellow named William Newmark. Newmark looked at national parks in the western United States. That's Tom Lovejoy on the left in the Amazon. William Newmark looked at national parks in the western United States and considered them as islands. A national park or a wilderness area or a wildlife refuge, by definition, is an island of protected landscape. Even if it's not completely isolated from wild landscape at the point that it's designated, it's destined to become isolated. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to protect it. And the national parks of the western U.S. have been in the process of becoming isolated for the last 80 or 100 years since they were established. This occurred to Newmark, and he thought, well, I wonder if we'll find processes of local extinction on these national parks in the western U.S. And if so, I wonder if it will correlate with size of the parks and with remoteness of the parks and also with how long the park has been isolated. So he went around to the national parks and he looked at records of species sighting of the native animals of each park, which species had been there at the point the park was established, when those species had last been sighted if they didn't seem to be there anymore. And he made charts of the local extinction of a number of different species on parks in the western U.S. What he found was dramatic enough that an excerpt from his dissertation was published in the journal Nature in London. And people have been talking about the Newmark study ever since. What did he find? Well, he found the same thing that Lovejoy had found in the Amazon. He found that MacArthur and Wilson were right. He found that there was a strong correlation between the size of an isolated patch of habitat, the size of a national park, and the extinctions that occurred there. The smallest national parks tended to lose the most species. For instance, let's go back to that map. What have we got here? Well, Glacier National Park, Yellowstone and Grand Teton. This probably would be Rocky Mountain National Park. This would be Mesa Verde. This would be, I suppose, Grand Canyon. Zion, Bryce Canyon National Park in southern Utah, Sequoia, Yosemite, on up to Olympic in the upper left-hand corner. Newmark found the correlation that he expected. The smaller the park, the more species went extinct. Yosemite is a medium-sized park. It's lost the red fox, the mink, and the brush rabbit. Those 3 species were native. They're no longer found in Yosemite. Not because humans hunted them out, not because humans poisoned them out. These species that Newmark was looking at were only the ones that had disappeared because of these island processes that I've been talking about. Zion National Park, one of those ones in the southwest corner of Utah. It's only a quarter of the size of Yosemite, but it had more extinctions. The badger is gone from Zion National Park, the pika, Nuttall's cottontail rabbit, and the black bear is no longer found in Zion National Park. Bryce Canyon, that's the smallest one in southern Utah. It's about a quarter the size of Zion. Bryce Canyon has lost the red fox, the beaver, the Utah prairie dog, white-tailed jackrabbit, northern flying squirrel, spotted skunk, and the pronghorned antelope. None of those are anymore found in Bryce Canyon National Park. Because they've been hunted out? No, because of island processes. They've gone extinct because they were small, isolated populations. The largest park complex that Newmark looked at hadn't lost any species. That was what people call the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. This area of wild land includes Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton National Park, and portions of 6 national forests that surround it. It's all one continuous island, and beyond that you get into cattle ranches and superhighways and my house and a lot of other blights on the landscape. One of the species that still survives in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and almost nowhere else in the lower 48 states is the grizzly bear, Ursus arctos horribilis. It's the biggest and the wildest and the craziest and the most fearsome predatory animal that this continent still supports. How many grizzly bears currently exist in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem? What scientists figure is that there are about 200 in this island of northern Rockies forest. 200 grizzly bears in the entire Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. How many of those are reproductive females? Probably only about 45, which makes it essentially a smaller population for reproductive purposes still. Is that a large, comfortable population? No, it's not. It's a precariously small population like the Mauritius kestrel. The grizzlies of Yellowstone are isolated from all other grizzly populations. There's a population in Glacier Park, but there's no traffic in grizzly bears between Yellowstone and Glacier. There are a couple of populations in Idaho, but there's no movement of grizzly bears across that land. It's an island species and it's stuck in Greater Yellowstone. Given those different kinds of bad luck that I talked about, those fluctuations of populations, the problems of bad years, of bad genetics, of inbreeding, of the chance birth of too many males, of possibility of catastrophe like a great forest fire. There's every chance in the world that the grizzly could disappear, that 200 bear population is not at all a secure population in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Okay, meanwhile, there's a very hot debate back where I live over the issue of how the United States Forest Service should manage those 6 national forests that are part of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that surround Yellowstone Park and Grand Teton Park. How should your U.S. Forest Service and mine manage those national forests? Should they clear-cut big areas of timber, as they have been doing, in order to feed the local sawmills and to keep the local timber jobs and to subsidize essentially the timber industry, and in the process keep shrinking that island by scraping away portions of those national forests so that the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is smaller and smaller every year? Or should they, as some people say, continue to let those national forests stand as part of an intact, continuous, wild, mature ecosystem? And in doing so, preserve the last big island Whoops. Kip, can you help me get back to those slides, about 4 slides back? I can't back up apparently anymore. I need about the last 3 or 4. Good. Thank you. So should they continue to let this whole area be eroded with clear cuts in order to support a timber industry that is destined to run out of timber eventually anyway? Or should they let those forests continue to stand as an intact ecosystem and preserve the last big island and the last, where did he go? And the last great animal that America has? It's not just a decision that's being made in the Northern Rockies, it's being made all over the world. And these are the questions that make island biogeography important as well as interesting. How do we manage the remaining parcels of wild landscape in the world? Do we chop it all up into ever smaller pieces? Do we let some of it stand as great continuous tracts of wilderness? Do we find ways to mitigate the effects of fragmentation once it has been chopped up? We live in an age in which island biogeography has come to the mainlands. And now we've got the choice of either dealing with all the difficult challenges of the new situation and making an effort to develop creative, scrambling, improvisational solutions to these problems, the way Carl Jones has done with the kestrel and Mauritius, or we can sit back and accept the consequences. Thank you.
For example, in these national parks that you're talking about, where the red tops would disappear, these other species, would it be pointless to bring these back into the national parks without a constant influx of new animals, or do you believe that it would just go the way of the rest of the islands, that reintroduction would?
So that's a good question. Essentially, it depends probably on how big the park is. Reintroduction of species in cases where it's been hunted out or poisoned out would make a lot of sense. For instance, the wolf is gone from the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, I didn't mention that as part of the Newmark study because it's not gone because the island was too small. It's gone because it was hunted out. It was exterminated in the 1920s. And now there's a big fight about whether or not we should reintroduce the wolf to Yellowstone. I happen to believe we definitely should because it's part of the ecosystem. One of the things you have in Yellowstone is too many elk. You've got something like 20,000 elk. They're eating up a lot of the aspen trees before they can mature. They're grazing too heavily on a lot of the winter range. Elk are popular, but you've just got too many of them. And one of the reasons you have too many is because there's no wolf. It would make all the sense in the world, scientifically, to reintroduce the wolf to Yellowstone. And you wouldn't have to keep reintroducing it. You wouldn't have to keep supplying animals. You could put probably a few pairs of wolves into the Yellowstone ecosystem, and they would start to breed like rabbits, and they would do quite well. You could even let ranchers continue to exterminate them as they came out of the park or as they came out of the ecosystem. This is what the wolf scientists have said. Yellowstone would be a wonderful ecosystem for wolves, and you could let ranchers kill every wolf that they saw on their own land, and you would still have a good population of wolves in Yellowstone. It's a really, really hot political subject. It's not going to be answered by scientific arguments. There's a lot of emotion involved, but in that case it makes all the sense in the world. Putting the black bear back into, I can't remember which park I said the black bear disappeared from. Was it Zion? I think so. Putting a population of black bear back into Zion probably would not do any good because they've disappeared because the island is too small. Yeah?
What thoughts do you have about creation of corridors between islands? Has there been any mechanisms suggested for doing that in your part of the country?
There have been, yeah. And you sound like somebody who has followed island biogeography a bit. That's one of the things that the scientists have been talking about. It's very much a part of it. When you're fragmenting ecosystems, when you're reducing the amount of wild land, if you at least leave corridors between these islands, then there's a chance that you'll have travel from one island to the next, and you won't get the same extinction processes. Corridors are a hot topic. I know that some people, like Dan Simberloff, just don't believe that they work, and that they can also be harmful in some cases, in terms of allowing disease transfer between islands. You know, it's a complicated scientific question. It's beginning to be talked about even in the Northern Rockies in connection with the grizzly bear. Some people are saying, well, maybe could we have corridors for grizzly bears to move between Glacier and Yellowstone? It's probably impracticable, and it's probably also absolutely necessary. So I don't know what's going to happen. But corridors is obviously a very important part of this subject. Yeah?
If man doesn't tamper with Yellowstone at all, is the grizzly still destined to become extinct?
If man doesn't tamper any further, if we don't cut any more of those national forests, that's a good question. It's probably right on the borderline. The best judgment of conservation biologists who study a subject called viable populations, the sizes of populations that can remain indefinitely healthy, suggests that the grizzly right now is right on the borderline, or it may be below the borderline. There's a federal biologist named Chris Servine who is head of the grizzly bear recovery team based in Missoula, Montana, and it's his job to finish a new recovery plan on how to save grizzly bears, not just in Yellowstone, but also in these smaller patches where there's much less than 200 in the population, like in the Selway Bitterroot range of western Montana. Corridors are one possibility. Also, movement of bears artificially from larger ecosystems into greater Yellowstone are one possibility of maintaining the genetic diversity that they need. So they're talking about maybe bringing one female bear into Yellowstone from the Canadian population every 10 years so that her genes can enrich the gene pool in Yellowstone. If they do that, they also have to take, and they hadn't calculated this in their latest draft of the plan, but they also have to take bears from Yellowstone and put them in, move them genetically into the Canadian system. Otherwise, they will eventually just rinse away and swamp out the Yellowstone gene pool by bringing in outside bears. So they're going to need to probably do something besides stop cutting the forest at this point. They've gone too far to just go away and leave it alone and hope that the bear would survive indefinitely. Yeah.
I just wonder if do you have any feeling about how the Clinton administration is going to handle some of these types of issues, because it seems like in the past there's been a lot of criticism. Like I know during the Watt period there were more oil wells drilled in that greater ecosystem than the previous four presidents had done. And Mr. Gore seems to be a leader in the environmental community, so you get a feeling of how they might handle this Forest Service land?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic at this point. And people in the federal agencies are saying, well, this is like a day and night change. Biologists in the federal agencies. You know, I don't want to be too optimistic and make too many assumptions, but I would guess that Bruce Babbitt is the best thing that's happened to the grizzly bear of the greater Yellowstone in a long, long time. And Babbitt has already made some appointments. For instance, he appointed George Frampton formerly president of the Wilderness Society, to be, I think, Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Parks and Wildlife. So he's going to be head of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. George Frampton cares about this stuff. The other thing that's coming out of the Clinton administration is that we're tired of subsidizing various forms of private enterprise, particularly in the West, like the timber industry, the ranching industry, the mining industry. The 1872 Mining Act represents essentially a giveaway of mineral rights to anybody who proves out a claim without any royalties taken. Incredible wealth of minerals are taken off these lands with very little cost to the mining companies that are doing it. Ranchers, I have a lot of very dear friends who are Montana ranchers, but ranchers graze cattle on federal land in the national forests, including in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, for far below what the market rate is for grazing on private land. And the timber sales that the Forest Service conducts on those national forests are generally below cost timber sales. So we taxpayers are subsidizing the private timber companies that come in and, having purchased a timber lease, cut that forest that grizzly bears had been using. So you eliminate subsidies for those three industries, you almost don't need to do anything else. Although it would be nice to do some other things. But those are huge first steps, and I'm very optimistic. Yes?
When you consider the impacts of the island biogeography, is it going to be impossible in the future to preserve endangered species by putting them in like national wildlife refuges? But because those refuges are islands, will they eventually become extinct anyway?
Well, if the refuges aren't big enough, and if there aren't some creative things that are done genetically, yes, that's a big problem. We can't, and it partly depends on what you're talking about in terms of refuges. Are you talking about large pieces of wild land or sort of small fenced compounds?
Like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge?
Well, yeah, that's the solution. The solution is to set aside as many areas as we can and have at least some of them be large areas. We can't just set aside lots of little areas, because little areas are fine for little species, but large species need large areas to support large populations. If you don't have large populations, they go extinct. So for bears, for tigers, for lions, for all of the big animals, we're going to need big reserves. And if we don't have them, we won't have those species.
You considered in your book the impact of global climate change on these isolated islands, big or small?
Yeah. I'm not going into that much. It's a big can of worms, but it's important. It is an issue, and it's an issue that Tom Lovejoy is very much involved with. He talks a lot about global warming and the interplay between global warming and the fragmentation of habitats. Because one of the other things that happens is you chop these pieces of wild land into fragments, is that migratory animals can't migrate. And if the climate changes, lots of animals would need to migrate, or would need to shift their range in order to follow the environmental conditions, the ecological conditions that they need to live. If you make those cuts so that species that are living in southern Ontario can't migrate toward the Arctic Circle, or species that are living in any place in the southern parts of the Serengeti can't migrate following the ecological conditions that they need, then you've got big trouble. And climate change is looming as a factor there. Anybody else at all?
David, thanks again for a fine lecture.
You're welcome. Thank you all.